Ladies and gentlemen, a couple housekeeping things. If you are not a fluent English and Turkish speaker, please put on the headphones now so you don't miss any of the conversation that we're about to have. Channel 1 is English, Channel 2 is Francais, Channel 3, Turkce. We have a few traditions at Halifax International Security Forum. In 2010, we began the Halifax Chat almost by accident when Senator McCain's plane was a full day late because of a hurricane here in Halifax. Robin Shepherd, who will host the Halifax Chat and has been doing so since 2010, will again moderate this session. It is a real honor to introduce the 11th President of Turkey, the Honorable Abdullah Gül. I have known him since 2002. We have all watched his career and his country in the past few years, and it's a real privilege to have him here on his first visit to Canada. Mr. President, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Peter, and let me repeat that heartfelt welcome to this forum. Not being Canadian, they decided to go their separate ways from us a little while ago. I can't say welcome to Canada on behalf of Canada, but it's a real privilege having you here. And it's somewhat extraordinary, I was just thinking before we came on, that for all the discussions we've had, many of which have touched on very serious subjects such as in Syria, in Iraq, the broader situation, that one of the pivotal countries in that region, and in fact bordering on so many regions, bordering into Europe, bordering to its north, into the Caspian, into the former Soviet space, and into the wider Middle East, that we haven't discussed that. And I think there's a sense in certainly where I come from, that Turkey has been kind of drifting away from the West. Perhaps with the EU in mind, to be fairer, it's being pushed away from the West. There's a sense that Turkey is now more Islamic than it used to be, less predictable than it used to be, less certain than it used to be. But the whole purpose of having you here, Mr. Gül, is not that you get a sense of what my senses are. We want to know what you think. And I wonder if you could begin by giving us an overview of how you see the region and how you see Turkey's place in the region, and bringing in any of the subjects that you think are relevant rather than having me impose what I think is relevant upon you.
First of all, thank you. His Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, I have been following the Halifax meetings for the past 5 years, and I am indeed honored to be a guest here. And I would like to thank my dear friend, Minister McKay, very much, and of course, President of the Forum, Peter van Braak, for their invitation. I would like to, first of all, offer you a brief summary of my ideas about the region, and I have some notes just to save from time, and then I will move on to your questions and respond to any questions that you may have. So I have been following the forum for the past 5 years, and I'm here now. I started my active political career in 1991, which overlapped with the first Gulf War and the Middle East Peace Conference held in Madrid right after that as a direct consequence of that. The leaders of the time were very much aware of the complex links and indirect interactions between the Palestine problem, the nervous center of the region, and other problems in the Middle East. These complex links are unfortunately still there. Since that day, I have witnessed many initiatives, plans, projects, and contacts launched in order to resolve various conflicts conflicts in the Middle East. I personally contributed to some of these processes as a member of the parliament, as a prime minister, foreign minister, and finally as president of the republic. And there have also been cases where I took personal initiative. Indeed, the international community spent an immense deal of energy in creating permanent peace, stability, and cooperation in the Middle East. It made political investments and mobilized intellectual and financial resources. In this context, I would like to express my appreciation for the sincere and unfaltering efforts of the U.S. administrations from both parties, including President Obama, Foreign Secretary Kerry, Senator McCain, Senator Mitchell, and other politicians and diplomats. Of course, I have to express my appreciation of that. And to this, I should also add the Saudi King Abdullah, who submitted an invaluable plan known by his own name, other actors in the region, as well as efforts by Russia and, of course, Canada. Unfortunately, the efforts spanning the quarter of a century since the Madrid conference have not yielded the desired results. The modest progress achieved should be set aside at this point. Moreover, thousands of innocent people, both in the region and outside, have fallen victim to violence or terror originating from the Middle East. Last summer, the people of Gaza experienced a huge tragedy. The atrocious murders of ISIS and the victims at the synagogue in Jerusalem past week are most recent examples of all these pains, which have even inflicted Canada. And not long ago, unfortunately, lives were lost in Canada too. So today we stand at a point where the situation has become graver, let alone progress. While Saddam Hussein was the only threat in 1991, the threats have been multiplied, creating a cumulative effect. In 1991, President Bush and President Gorbachev had held the Madrid Peace Conference jointly, whereas today, in this environment, it's unlikely that the US and Russia will do the same after the most recent developments. Following the first Gulf War, UN Security Council Resolution 687 stipulating the disarmament of Iraq became operational. Let me remind you that this resolution also included a perspective and a provision on the freeing of the region from weapons of mass destruction. And in return, this provision had also secured Arab support in the Gulf War. However, these promises are far from being fulfilled, except the conference initiated by President Obama in 2010, but that did not yield too many results either. The key term to express the gravity of the situation in the region at present can be frustration. This big frustration can explain both the reasons and consequences of the conflicts, and indeed the elite of the region and the international community are deeply disappointed at the face of the failure to solve the problems in the Middle East. Well, everyone should really understand this state of frustration in the people in the region very well. Well, this has been a pessimistic overview of what has been going on in the region, and this is perhaps the reality. However, there have been good developments in recent months too. The clearance of Syria from chemical weapons has been a notable development, and if we act in a decisive manner, then it means that the whole region can actually be cleansed of the weapons of mass destruction. Another step further in the same field, but perhaps even more important, is the expectations that talks on Iran's nuclear program may bear positive results. These are expectations, hopes, and should they become reality, it means that multilateral mechanisms and a win-win diplomacy can indeed bring good results. In fact, in terms of this whole nuclear issue, during my time as both president and foreign minister, I held many meetings. I attended many meetings in Tehran and in Turkey, and I think that I have been the only NATO allied leader who spoke these issues directly to the religious leader of Iran. And I spoke very, very openly about this with him. If Iran nuclear talks reach success, this will have strategic, political consequences both in the region and the world. So if there will be a solution, then we have to prepare for the situation in the post-solution era. And a solution to the nuclear file may create a difference by leading Iran to be more engaged in problems of the region and their solutions. Another important but belated development is the establishment of a more inclusive Iraqi government with a broader base. This is indeed a very important development. And this has been enabled by the common sense and coordinated efforts of actors in and outside of Iraq, and as a result of their ability to focus well. I remember of the meetings of the foreign ministers of countries neighboring Iraq, which I launched during my time as Prime Minister in 2003 during the Second Gulf War. We held 9 meetings jointly with the countries neighboring Iraq, and we brought them together with the P5, and we were able to discuss a common agenda. Now, after the setting up of the new government, I believe that everyone should support the Iraqi government in coordination. Another positive sign is the resolution of disagreements between the Iraqi regional Kurdish government and the Iraqi government about the political issues and financial problems in connection with oil revenues. And I think that they're about to reach success there. And the dropping of the possibility of a referendum on independence from the agenda in the Kurdish region, at least for the moment, is also good news for stability, for the stability of the region. There's no doubt that the coalition formed against ISIS has been a major step forward in the region. Again, this has happened, although it's a belated development. And we started yielding the first positive military outcomes in the field. However, hard power alone will not be a solution. The ultimate solution lies in patient and inclusive political solutions, which will help convince the local people and leaders in Syria and Iraq who have been lured to enter the dictate of ISIS because of despair, frustration, and lack of hope. I believe that we have to work hard to gain their minds. Political transition and exit strategies must be considered already now, and mistakes once committed in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria should not be repeated. Possible solutions should take the political and socioeconomic imbalances of states into account and must be morally superior. This is because ISIS is a phenomenon where all diseases of the region, including political, ideological, economic, and social ones, have crystallized. This is how we should view it. Another interesting trend in the region is the decision by some European countries, European parties and parliaments, to recognize the state of Palestine. This is indeed an important development. And this trend reflects a serious disappointment about the deadlock regarding a possible solution in Palestine, and I hope that it will contribute to the efforts of the parties in Israel and Palestine defending peaceful settlement and encourage them. When I was elected the President of the Republic in 2007, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas and Israeli President Shimon Peres came to Ankara to congratulate me, and they addressed the Turkish Grand National Assembly jointly. And this was probably the only speech held by Peres in a Muslim country. So such atmospheres can indeed be reinstated. The Arab Spring is indeed an important matter in itself. There is both a bad and a good news. The bad news is that the first wave of the Arab Spring has been disrupted, except in Tunisia. The good news, on the other hand, is that the expectations, yearnings, and concerns of Arab peoples are still alive and valid. Demands raised during the Arab Spring, such as democracy, good governance, human rights, transparency, gender equality, social justice, and freedom of thought, will continue to prevail the agenda. Just like the ideals and principles of the 1789 French Revolution, which were realized in France, and the world decades after the revolution, despite the fact that the revolution had been reversed by the restoration of monarchy, adopted these principles and did not give up on those ideals and demands. And all of these ideals have now become a reality in many parts of the world, and I believe that they will also become a reality in the Arab world. Likewise, there is a vision in the region regarding the setting up of a cooperation and security system similar to that of OSCE, Organization for Security and Development in Europe. This is a vision that has been around since the 1980s. This vision must be kept alive and remain a part of the agenda, I believe. And this strategy will also require a very strong economic cooperation dimension that encompasses pipelines, energy, and even water issues. So efforts that will increase the level of welfare in the region should continue. All the positive developments I have referred to above include some possibilities, lessons, and clues. I believe that we can make a difference if all of these are tackled by political actors within a holistic and strategic approach, with a constructive mentality and on common ground. This will serve peace and stability, not only for the people of the Middle East, but also for the whole world. And probably the biggest issue of the world right now after the Second World War is just this. And this issue is causing a lot of discomfort everywhere in the world. Let me conclude here, but to move on to what you just asked. The AKP in Turkey, the Justice and Development Party in Turkey, was set up in 2002. I first became an MP in 1991, and my colleagues then, including the President Erdogan, was a mayor before the setting up of the party, and we set up AKP as a conservative party. When we say conservative, it of course has traditions, history, religion, and nearly all of the Turkish population are Muslims. So when it comes to religion, of course, we're talking about Muslim values. So we owned up to our own religious ideals, but also followed the modern world, the requirements and values of democracy and law. So this is the kind of administration we established. And in the past 10 years, Turkey has witnessed great transformations. And I believe everybody is able to see that. And we will not be taking any steps backward in that sense. Certainly, we may have certain reflections of the problems in the general region, but this is the orientation of Turkey. And our party started Turkey's accession talks with the EU. Our government started the accession talks in the EU, and we are determined to conclude them. So I'll be happy to take any questions you may have.
A tour de force indeed of the region and the history, and it's necessary because we often forget the context and your own personal experiences of the conflicts and the potential resolutions and all the major actors in the region is invaluable. I'm not going to take on the entire burden of the questioning, but I am going to ask a couple of questions. It seemed to me you struck more a note of optimism than pessimism in your overview. You perhaps when you mentioned the French Revolution and things turned out all right in the end, well, it did take 150 or 200 years. Perhaps we hope it won't take quite so long in the region. I wanted to ask, among many of the questions, which, as I say, I will share with the audience, one specifically about Syria and Islamic State. There is a view which appears to be coming out of Turkey fairly loudly and fairly clearly. Also, you can find it in the United States of America. I doubt that Senator McCain, for instance, would be in too much disagreement with this, that at least in the medium term, we can get to a state where we don't have either Bashar Assad or Islamic State. And yet there's also a very strong feeling in this part of the world, in the Western world, that actually, that argument is a bit old-fashioned now. We're probably going to have to accept that we either have one or the other. Can you give us a reason to be optimistic as to why we don't have to make that decision? It isn't Hobson's choice, and we can, in fact, move towards a future where both Syria and Iraq are democratic without the likes of Assad or the likes of Islamic State.
Great mistakes have been made, unfortunately. Great mistakes have been made. First of all, there was a lot of rhetoric in the beginning, but that was not backed up by real power. And this was noticed, and I think that that was a big mistake. At that time, I read reports from military meetings, and I saw this intensive rhetoric, and I looked at how they behaved in real fact. And because I was the president then, I responded both to our allies and visitors, and Mr. Senator would also remember that I told him, I said that Iran and Russia are committing, and if the other party does not commit as heavily, there will be a big vacuum and unexpected things can come out of that vacuum, I said. And unfortunately, this is where we stand right now. When you look at the Islamic State, there are terrorists coming from the international area. There are remnants of the Saddam army, but the remaining people are the people there. So go back 4 or 5 years ago. They were regular citizens, loyal to their country. But when there's a vacuum and when there is a leadership hijacking them, this is where we ended up. So, of course, you have to act decisively. And you get the results when you act decisively. The last military operations have really given or dealt heavy blows on ISIS. But this is not the end of the road. The mistakes made have also created both an Arab and Sunni rage or anger, and this is what we have today. Otherwise, I don't think that the people of Mosul would agree to this kind of behavior, conduct, administration. They would not normally say yes to such an understanding of religion or administration, but people were really stuck in a deadlock, and they were hijacked. So you have to act decisively from a military perspective, but you really have to gain the people of the region.
You talk about, leadership, and you talked about a vacuum that was then filled. What interests me is, and perhaps other people in the audience here too, is what role does Turkey have to play in terms of leadership in the region? Do you believe that Turkey should be playing a supportive role to a more assertive America, Or should it perhaps be the other way around, that an assertive Turkey should be seeking the support of Western powers? Because Turkey is right there on the border. You have a major refugee problem from Syria right now. You're also a victim country. Turkey is a victim country of the crisis in Syria. What can, or what more can Turkey do itself to bring greater stability and a better prospect for the future for Syria and Iraq?
Turkey is doing a great deal, but I think we're not able to communicate that as well. First of all, there's something that nobody is referring to nowadays. Where are those 2 million Syrians? They are in Turkey, in Turkish cities. Germany, I don't think they admitted that many refugees in the past 20 years. So you have about 2 million people to whom Turkey opened up its gates and is carrying the financial burden. This in itself is something that people should appreciate about Turkey. And secondly, Turkey would never like to have an unstable or insecure neighbor country. No one would want that. We want to have stability and a good structure, sound structure, both in Iraq and Syria. But we're not a country that puts its hands and meddles in these countries. We worked a lot on Iraq, but whatever we said was counterproductive somehow. And I don't understand the reason for that. But people arrived at the point that we suggested, but at a later stage in time. And now an inclusive government is there, and we help that government in any way that we can. The Prime Minister of Turkey visited Baghdad and Erbil and met with Arabs and Turks in northern Iraq, and we are in intensive contacts with the people, Turks and Kurds there. In terms of Syria, I think the whole public opinion knows that Turkey has a 900-kilometer border and how deeply Turkey is involved. But let me remind you once more that those refugees are there in Turkey. So I think that people sometimes take the easy way out and criticize Turkey too easily without thinking about those refugees.
So I saw this gentleman here first.
Thank you. Christian Whiten with the Hamilton Foundation. You said Turkey doesn't interfere in other people's affairs, in other governments' affairs, but in fact, Turkey does. Turkey supports Hamas, which is a terrorist organization, an Iranian proxy army on Israel's border, which is attempting to destroy Israel. And Turkey supports the Muslim Brotherhood, a political group which shares the same goals as Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Ansar al-Sharia. So this seems inconsistent. And also, I'm just curious, as a member of NATO, aside from hosting refugees, as a member of NATO, you get a defense guarantee. What do you think Turkey owes NATO in return for that? Doesn't it owe them to be at least on the same political side of this divide? And if you were setting policy in Ankara, would you end Turkey's support for Hamas, that terrorist organization? Thank you.
Should we take that as a very quick yes or no answer? Or would you like to expand a little? Yes, the question is that the Turkish government has been supportive of Hamas, which is designated a terrorist organization in Western countries. Turkey is also a member of NATO. And the question was, does Turkey feel that since it has a security guarantee from NATO, it also therefore has an obligation to give back to NATO in terms of supporting NATO's efforts, for example, in the Middle East, but also being more aligned with NATO policies on, for example, issues such as Hamas?
Doğrusu burada biraz
Well, I think that you're not being exactly fair, and this is an emotional statement. Having peace in the Middle East, especially between Israel and Palestine, and even with Syria, would be something that would contribute Israel the most. And Turkey worked very hard, both Palestinians and the Syrian government then knows this. You may remember that we gathered these two parties at a hotel in Istanbul, and there were nearly direct contacts before the Gaza attacks. What I'm trying to say here is that we have worked very hard once. We used all our capacity for a bi-state solution. But if these are not appreciated, then what else is there for me to say? Of course, the ship, the flotilla issue, taking humanitarian aid to Gaza was not our ideas only. The whole international organizations, the European Union, the UN, they all took on calls to do humanitarian aid there. And the attack on this civilian ship really had a detrimental effect on our relations, you know that. You should not have any doubts about Turkey's good intentions. We still want Turkey to contribute to peace there, and we continue to contribute. The current state of our relations with Israel may not really reflect this, but our relations with Palestine is totally based on this.
Questions, because we're over in 10 minutes.
Thank you. Jonathan Tepperman, Foreign Affairs Magazine. When you were Prime Minister and then President of Turkey, you were a brave and bold voice for the protection of civil rights, of human rights, press freedoms, etc. in Turkey. Are you at all concerned with the direction in which the country is going now, where whether you look at things like press freedoms or other rights issues, the country seems to be headed in a negative direction? I'm hoping that you'll take advantage of the fact that you're retired from politics to comment. Thank you.
We'll take another question from the gentleman over here.
Thank you. Welcome to Canada, Mr. President. Yves Baudeur. I'm the Ambassador of Canada at NATO. Question builds upon another one that was asked before. What would be needed to actually bring back good relations between Israel and Turkey? And can we hope that this would happen within the next short while? Thank you.
Thank you for a very good question. The lady here, please. I'll remind you, yes, sure.
Pippa Malmgren, former advisor to President George W. Bush. Turkey's in the very interesting position of being both in NATO and an observer of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Could you talk a little bit about how Turkey balances both going forward under the current leadership?
Okay, so did you understand that question? Yes, so do you want to start with that one and then we'll work backwards? Please go ahead.
Evet, ekonomik kalkınma ile ilgili. First of all, let me talk about democracy. Should I just give one answer to all the questions?
Absolutely, yes. Well, if you can summarize all those questions in one answer, that's... I couldn't, but...
First of all, it's clear where Turkey is headed. Turkey is a country that started accession talks with the EU and wants to conclude these. And, well, if certain chapters are still not open, the responsibility also partially belongs to Europe. The second issue is, of course, democracy is a process. Democratization is a process of becoming excellent, perfecting things. This is a process that still continues in Turkey. When we started our talks with the EU, we looked at we started the negotiations because we were fulfilling the Copenhagen criteria, but we still have a way to go. We're doing many things. We know that many taboos are being abolished. And I do understand why you're asking these questions. I see that there is a level of discomfort, but I think these are temporary. There are reasons for that, and the main trend, the main orientation, direction of Turkey is on the way of democratization, and Turkey is working to enhance its standards about the rule of law, and I have no hesitations about that.
Between China in Asia, but we belong to Europe. As I said, we have been negotiating for the full membership with the European Union. So it's not the question in Turkey. It's not the matter in Turkey. We don't discuss, we don't debate that in Turkey.
There was a question from the ambassador to NATO about relations between Israel and Turkey, and the question was, can they realistically be properly repaired anytime soon?
Contacts continue, and I believe that a certain distance has already been covered, but there has been some halt. But I believe that this is something that will be overcome in the near future.
Mr. President, as I said, it's short and sweet, and and I'm sure everybody else is deeply grateful for your contribution, and we'd like to thank you very much for being here today. So, we're not having a break now. Thank you. Very, very good. I think people very much.
Докладываю. Это сбежавшая с Крыма часть, сдаваться ни копеечки не хотят. Их сейчас уговаривают, с Володарского приехал парень, бывший военный. Не будут они сдаваться, не хотят. Не знаю, как он уговорит их.
Значит, кладите их на землю. Вот угроза. Сейчас прибыл Ромашка, нет?
Нет, когда он прибудет?
Дождись Ромашку, после этого как следует заблокируй.
Идея такая, что вот осуществить эту штуку. И сегодня здесь, в Донецке, будут представители, генеральный секретарь Совета Европы. Мы вместе эту акцию проводим.
У меня нет никаких возражений по одной простой причине. Со мной все уже обговорили.
Очень хорошо. Значит, тогда задача состоит в том, как мы можем туда приехать с тем, чтобы осуществить это.
Да. Его невозможно будет законно провести.
Да вы в партии все что угодно. Напишите, что 99%, бля. Вы что? Вы будете ходить, блядь, эти бумажки собирать? Ебанутые, что ли, нахуй?
Все, я понял.
Ну пишите, что 90, ну не миллион, там 89%, блядь, за Донецкую республику. Все нам, пиздец нам.
Значит, это Чернухинские сбили самолет. Пилотом с Чернухинского блокпоста. Казаки, что на Чернухина стоят.
Да, майор.
Значит, самолет рассыпался в воздухе в районе шахты Петропавловской. Первый 200-й. Нашли первого 200-го. Была женщина. Да, гражданский.
Понятно. А этот, как и, народу много там?
Understood. Yes, I'm just a soul whose intentions are good. Oh Lord, please don't let me be misunderstood.
I do agree that whoever is making these videos deserves some sort of Canadian Academy Award or Global Academy Award. So remarkable work. So we're here today with a wonderful panel to discuss the topic, gaining intelligence, missing the meaning, and we'll try to gain the meaning here of a lot of things. And we have just to my right Liz Doucette, Chief International Correspondent of the BBC. She is a native Canadian, so it's great to have you back in your own country and back from London. And we have General Mike Rogers, Commander of the United States Cyber... Admiral.
As much pride as I have in my fellow services. I'm a Navy guy.
Well, you know, I kept thinking Mike Rogers. I've been looking for Mike Rogers all day, thinking that we had Mike Rogers, who's the outgoing chair of the House Intelligence Committee, and so happy we have the other Mike Rogers, also in intelligence, who is commander of the U.S. Cyber Commander and Director of the National Security Agency and Chief of the Central Security Agency. So we have Peter MacKay, Minister of Justice and Attorney General, Department of Justice here in Canada, really the co-founder, the great icon who launched this conference, and Jane Harman. Who doesn't know Jane Harman? Who doesn't fear Jane Harman? Director and President and Chief Executive Officer of the Woodrow Wilson Center, but of course a longtime member of Congress. And perhaps, you know, in my book, and I've written and done profiles on Jane in The Atlantic. I'm Steve Clemens, I'm editor-at-large of The Atlantic. In my profiles of Jane, it's very, very hard to find someone that's thought as deeply about intelligence, but also understands the technical dimensions, because part of what we're going to be discussing today, and I think with all of you, is in the intelligence game out there, where there's now so many more resources, but there's still so many gaps. Part of, at least the U.S. side of this, and I'm sure it's true for every country, is how good are your legislators in both having oversight, helping, and collaborating with other branches of government who are tasked with protecting us and using this arena. So thank you all very much for being here. And I thought that just to set things up for a minute, I would go back, add a little bit of editorial tension to this before we begin, and then take a few questions. And I went back. Dana Priest of the Washington Post, a prize-winning writer, did an expose of articles on the intelligence industrial complex in the United States. And she wrote that is the intelligence, a hidden world growing beyond our control. She noticed that there were 1,271 government organizations, 1,931 private companies working in counterterrorism, homeland security, and intelligence in 10,000 locations in the United States. That there were 854,000 people cleared at the top security level. That the intelligence wings of government occupy 17 million square feet, which is roughly 3 Pentagons. So as we go into this study and discuss it, I think, you know, Mike, really what I first want to say, because you're in charge of so much of this, I mean, do you know what you control and what you don't?
I'd like to think I do.
Yeah, but I mean, in that world, we're talking about resources, we've seen whatever, I mean, part of this is give us just a quick snapshot of how you see what we're not achieving today, given, nonetheless, all the resources we have.
I mean, first I would argue the complexity of the challenge set that as an intelligence professional we're dealing with continues to grow in significant ways. When I look back, when I started my journey as an intelligence professional 28 years ago, and I think about the expectations of insights that I was expected to generate for policymakers and military commanders, and I fast forward now 28 years to today, and I think that the level, the complexity, the breadth is just mind-blowing to me. What we expect our people to understand and to generate insights on. Secondly, I will say, as the new guy, I have asked, one of the questions I asked the organization was, have we gotten to the point where size is starting to work against us? where we're not fast and agile enough to do.
You're just
what we
asking
need
that now.
to do. As I'm brand new.
Yeah.
I'm new in the job. So one of the questions I've asked now as the leader of an organization is to try to come to grips with that. There is no doubt that the size issue is a challenge. It offers both great capability, but it can also be a limiter and an inhibitor to you at times, particularly when not only you think about the large organization that is the National Security Agency and also U.S. Cyber Command, but the large numbers of partnerships and relationships that are foundational to the future. Because as this expectation of knowledge grows for you, the places that you have to go to generate that insight, the partners you need to help you, they also grow. So the numbers and complexity of people and organizations that you're dealing with are just amazing to me.
So let me interrupt. I want to jump, before I jump to Jane and involve some of you in the audience more directly. So hopefully we've got mic runners here because we're going to involve you sooner than later. I just finished reading 2 novels by David Ignatius. David Ignatius is a scary guy when you read his novels. David Ignatius, many of you know, is a national security correspondent for the Washington Post, and he wrote a book called Blood Money, and more recently, The Director. And David is an intel-obsessed guy, and what I worry is that he hangs out with people like you for dinner and then goes and turns it into fiction, and you wonder how fictional they are. But in one of the books, there's a lot in there about drones, a drone attack that hit a family in Afghanistan, and that a young genius in that book then uses the methodologies of associative intelligence and finance and begins going after CIA agents and other intel agents. Great, interesting novel. And then the other in The Director, the CIA director who comes in, essentially is given, a rough-knuckled treatment of the world of hackers, a very different world, not the world we have here. We don't have folks with tattoos and T-shirts and red sneakers and, hanging out all night. And so I'm interested in, as we think about intelligence and talking, does the Halifax International Security Forum need a kind of another adjunct crowd of just a very different kind of caliber? Because when we think about what's happening in the world, how we're getting hacked and doing, they don't look like you.
Well, I will say, in the organization that I run, if you walk around our halls, you will find people with ponytails. You will find people in T-shirts. You will find people wearing jeans. Because
do they get promotions?
One day that person who's now, it is amazing. You watch the journey over time for many of them. One of the things that I'm trying to talk to the workforce about is, so how do you build the workforce of the future? It can't be that we're all cookie cutters of each other. That's not going to get us where we need to be. How do we create those public and private partnerships? I've been in Silicon Valley twice in the 7 months I've been in the job, because I believe outreach to the private sector is an important part of the challenge that I'm facing as the director of the NSA. And one of the things that strikes me, hey, look, we have differences, but we have very many similarities. We're all trying to go for the same workforce. So talk to me about the challenges that you have in the private sector and the technical world, creating and building a workforce and sustaining it over time. One of the things they tell me is, well, we average about 2.5 years for an employee's duration with us. And I go, wow, now is that different from a DoD governmental model? Most of my workforce, because they love the mission set. Once we get them in the door, they tend not to leave. It's 20 and 30 years for an average. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to figure out, maybe either extreme isn't the right answer. How do we make this a little bit more permeable so people can move in and out? We're trying to work our way through that to try to get to, I think, the point you're trying to make.
Jane, you've been monitoring this for many years. do you think that, use your nasty hat for a minute and critique our own critique our own thinking about the intelligence establishment. Do we need to break into different groups? And what are we missing when we talk about this subject? What are the key fundamental questions that we don't traditionally include in a forum like this?
First of all, it's a great question. Let me say first about the other Mike Rogers, who's leaving as chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. I'm a Democrat, he's a Republican. He joined the committee when I was the senior Democrat, which I was for 100 years. And he has added so much value. And the bipartisanship on that committee is an example of what Congress needs to get forward to or get back to. And oversight of our intelligence activity, I think this Mike Rogers would agree, is a central part of making it reflect what people in America and around the world want, and a central part of demonstrating that it does operate within strict limits. That's first. So
I mean,
now
my question, if it had been the other Mike Rogers here, is that just 2 days ago, his committee released 3 findings on Benghazi on the intelligence front that basically neutralized the debate. And I just wondered if anybody but an outgoing chair could have released such a report.
I don't know,
we'll
but
save that
it's
for another
very
day.
helpful,
Yeah.
what he just did. But to your question, we have to rethink this. When 2 massive intelligence failures happened in the United States, one was called 9/11, and another one was called the National Intelligence Estimate on Iraq, we rethought the organization of our intelligence community. The model was the 1947 National Security Act. There's no business in the world that could operate on a 1947 business model. So Congress, and I was one of the ringleaders in this, thought through a different organization for intelligence, and we passed in 2004 an Intelligence Reform Act. It surely wasn't perfect, but it was to create a joint command structure over 16 intelligence agencies, modeled after something called Goldwater-Nichols, which is how we reorganized our defense, our 4 defense services in the 1980s. At any rate, it's 10 years after that, and I would argue we have to rethink it again. It's not just about moving boxes. It's about really assessing what are the threats against us now. Cyber is a huge one. This Mike Rogers just scared the heck out of everybody 2 days ago. I'm sure he can explain. But also, the terror threat doesn't look like any terror threats we've seen before. Its use of social media is so sophisticated that, as far as I'm concerned, we're way out at the moment outrun
ISIS is
by what
apparently
ISIL does
sending
on
us
social media.
messages with the hashtag HISF 2014.
Did
I don't know
everyone
if you know
hear
that, but
that they hacked
yeah.
into this hashtag this morning, or so I was told?
Not hacked in, they just used it.
They just used it?
I mean, but you have to understand that, you know, when you think about ISIS as being retrograde, sort of medieval types that aren't tuned into the world, that want to go back to the 7th century, it's interesting that they are black marketing antiquities, and so someone has to know about an antiquity to get money, and that they're on the internet in the way they are. I mean, it raises fundamental questions of whether we're underestimating the kind of folks that are running this.
So they're making the sale more than we are. I mean, we not only have to block some of their sites. Someone here, Fran Townsend, I don't know if she's in the audience now.
Fran is in the center there. We were going to call on Fran.
She will be on a panel tomorrow and explain all the amazing things she and some others are doing. But we have to project counter messages that are more effective than theirs through social media. This has to be one of our most important tools if we're ever going to degrade, let alone defeat this
Let me
threat.
jump to Dov Zakheim for a second. Is there a microphone here? Somebody have a mic? Run, yeah. Well, can you run down here? Because Dov is responsible for a lot of this mess. No. Dov was comptroller at the Pentagon after 9/11, and I just want to, put you on the spot for a minute. And I don't want to actually say that. I mean, Dov's a good friend of mine, but I think in the, largely looking at the question of Dov, when the United States and really the West was hit in such an awful way after 9/11, and you saw, particularly within the Pentagon, which has 2/3 of the intelligence operations within the Pentagon, was it just growth everywhere? Was this the mission that every organization grabbed to budgetarily grow, or was there a plan in place to sort of look at mission objectives that would drive this? I ask it because when we look at things like the intel that we just saw in the Ukrainian case and the Russian with the shoot down of the private jetliner, and you see what we're able to do and gather, that's impressive. But when you look at the amount of firepower we have now, intelligence, the obvious question is, should we not have a lot more? And you were, in a way, watching most of it.
Well, I was the one that was paying for it.
Yeah.
You've got to remember that within, Jane, what was it, 2 weeks after 9/11, you guys threw $20 billion at us?
It was classified, whatever we did.
No, it wasn't. That was public. It was a supplemental, and it was $40 billion, and everybody fought over the $20 billion that wasn't going to the Pentagon, and nobody quarreled with the $20 billion.
To the Pentagon, but not the amount that went to intelligence.
No. That was to the Pentagon as a whole. But I think that's really what's behind your question. Mm-hmm. Because, even today, $20 billion is a little bit of money, and we get this all in one fell swoop. And we're reacting to ISIS, to rather Al-Qaeda at that point, it's pretty clear we know where the president wants to go. And so you start throwing the money out to whoever has a reasonable claim on it, including the intelligence crowd, but not only the intelligence crowd. And so, in a sense, this is going on as things are developing in Afghanistan, and before Afghanistan is over, things are developing in Iraq. So you have this constant demand, not just from the intelligence folks, and at that point, cyber wasn't what it is today either, but all over the place. And when that happens, you get growth that is almost beyond rationality. I'll give you a concrete example. We've added 80,000 civilians, forget military, 80,000 civilians to the Pentagon since 2001. Now, whether they've actually made a difference is a whole other issue. But just think of that, 80,000 people, because the demands kept on growing and growing and growing. Now, what you then get is people start saying, well, I've got all this money, how do I justify it next year to Congress? I really do need a coherent plan. But as you're trying to make a coherent plan, all kinds of new things are popping up on you. New demands for money, new demands for things like cyber, and it just constantly grows. And stepping back and saying, well, okay, is this what I really need? You know, having a Mike Rogers come in and say, is this the workforce I really need? Or should I be measuring my output differently than just counting up the dollars I'm spending? That becomes very difficult.
Peter? But that goes to this issue that Admiral Rogers raised, and that is the cumbersome nature now of our intelligence infrastructure becoming so big and unwieldy, and to be able to sort through the various sources that are coming in often through straws. So they're coming in isolation. What I think is successful in acting on intelligence, actionable intelligence, as they say, is when it's fused, not fudged, when it's fused.
What's the Canada model? Is your model on a relative basis similar to what the United States has done? Is it smaller? Are you finding some of the same successes and challenges in Canada? How do you
I think
compare?
we've evolved from different models, and obviously part of the Five Eyes community. As Minister Nicholson said, we rely heavily on the need to collaborate, to challenge. We have an aggressive challenge function within our system of intelligence, so we have oversight. We have a civilian oversight model and a commissioner. We also use what I think John McCain referred to as common sense. I think sometimes the obvious gets overlooked. Police are very successful when they're able to track burglars who put some of the merchandise they've stolen on Kijiji. Some of what we need to examine is right there in plain view. And that has to be fused into what the intelligence, human intelligence, signals intelligence, all of that. And it goes as well to the Admiral's point of going to outside sources, the private sector, bringing that into what still is a very difficult task of not only gathering an intelligence, sorting through it, but then making the very difficult political decision as to what to do with it. You know, it's like having a fire department that just puts out fires, or having a fire department that goes around and tries to find out who has all the matches and where they plan to set the fires. That's the game. I don't want to call it a game because it has such serious consequences, but we're trying to find out what they're going to do to us before they do it.
I think, if I could, I think there's two keys from an intelligence professional standpoint to me when I look at the future. The first is integration. It's not enough just to get fusion as a byproduct of all the work. My comment as the new guy is we got to integrate up front. And as we approach these problems from the very beginning, we got to do it in an integrated, multidisciplined function. Secondly, I think the key to success in some ways in intelligence in the future is going to be who's going to be the most effective at creating communities of interest, communities of expertise very quickly on issues that, quite frankly, a month ago, we had no clue we were even going to be caring about, that anyone was going to ask us about.
But there are a couple other things, and I think Peter said something that was very important about common sense. Just because we can doesn't mean we should, to quote our president when we got into some awkwardness over the Snowden leaks.
Or Angela Merkel or Rousseff or
boatloads of stuff. But it's not necessarily useful. I would argue that open source information, what you were talking about, is probably more useful now than much of our human intelligence that we spend boatloads of money to collect. And it's harder and harder to collect because we don't have people on the ground and people in places like Syria, or enough people on the ground. And understanding how social media works and the tweet world and doing data mining of that, of open sources, and building profiles on people through open sources, which the private sector in some ways can do better
actually
than
works at an organization that probably comes closest in the world to an open source CIA,
but
right?
What
That's
I'm
what the
saying
BBC
is that may be the best intelligence.
Well, is this plenary on the record? I'll just jump in here. I'm not a long-time congresswoman. I'm not a government minister or a head of an intelligence agency.
But you do have lots of.
I'm a journalist,
sources, yeah.
and we're supposed to write the first rough draft of history. But such is the nature of journalism today that most of the journalists who are here, they tend to keep going back to the same areas, and they acquire a certain expertise in the area, and they do, I think. It's part of the open source information, add to the collective knowledge. But unfortunately, because there are so many of these intelligence agencies around, in the world in which we live, and we talked about asymmetric warfare this morning, a lot of these anti-Western rebels see a person like me and assume I am a spy. And therefore, you've had the very sad cases of Jim Foley and Stephen Sotloff. They're seen not just as journalists, but they're out gathering information, and the information is seen as suspect. And so a world of too many intelligence agencies is getting in the way of the safety of journalists and our ability to do our job. And actually, I brought a little Exhibit A here just so I could bring a few other things into the conversation. This is my poor little battered computer, and I need one. And I took it to Iraq, and then suddenly things started happening with my email, and I sort of managed with it. Then I went to Aleppo, and then things really went bad with my email. There were so many people trying to read my email in Aleppo that AOL, which is one of the emails I use, were sending me messages 3 times a day saying, "Are you really Lise Doucette?" Until finally, there were so many people trying to access the email in the government-controlled side of Aleppo that my AOL account shut down and my BlackBerry shut down, and I was shut down from all of my accounts. Well, then I fixed it up a bit, and I went to Gaza. When I came out of Gaza, the Israeli military then took my poor computer and opened it up and turned it upside down. And never in the history of intelligence have so many people read my emails to my mother in New Brunswick. And in fact, I was in Afghanistan, so maybe Mike Rogers' agency was also reading my emails. All of which to say is that, we talk about American intelligence gathering, but there are many, many intelligence agencies on the ground collecting information when people like me and many others are trying to do the job. On the issue of Syria, and in this intelligence discussion, I want to focus on the second part of it, which is missing the meaning. And Jane, you mentioned 2 intelligence failures. It was 9/11, and there was Iraq. And the very good paper by Baroness Pauline Neville-Jones talks about how, in the Second Gulf War, outdated intelligence, lack of ability to test agent information against other sources, and misinterpretation of apparent battlefield evidence contributed to policy failure. I ask whether at some point, we will all say that Syria was also an intelligence failure. I'm someone who does go to Damascus. I can get a government visa. And for the last 4 years, I would keep hearing the CIA reports that Assad was going to fall. So I would time, I think, January 2012, he's going to fall, so I better get a visa and go to Damascus. And he would not fall. Then they would say, well, by the end of the year, Assad is going to fall. So I would, time my trips with the CIA assessment of when Assad was going to fall. And then I would go to Damascus and would find people were supporting him. And I thought, well, are they lying to me, or are they lying to the Syrian intelligence agency? And this went on for many years. And then I would also see Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, coming out of meetings with Sergei Lavrov and saying Assad is going to fall in days. And I'm thinking, well, the intelligence obviously fed into her. She's interpreting it, and she's telling the world that Assad's going to fall in days. And he is still there. And ladies and gentlemen, that is contributing to a policy failure, because if you wanted Assad to fall, he wasn't going to fall on his own. And therefore, you had to change the military balance, which the West refused to do. And as the diplomats would say, we are where we are. And it's the same thing with the moderate Syrian opposition. I am looking to see, where is the moderate Syrian opposition? There was one man who was held up, Jamal Marouf, who was supposed to be the new moderate Syrian opposition, which brought together about 14 different Free Syrian Army forces. Jamal Marouf was in Idlib, or in the north of Syria, right. And then he was defeated by Jabhat al-Nusra. So there's no moderate opposition in those areas. And yet, day in, day out, we hear that Assad is going to fall, and that the West is going to train the moderate Syrian opposition. I say, do we really have our intelligence right? are we asking the right questions, or is this all just based on wishful thinking and hoping that
And you've also raised the point of journalism and punditry in this as well. And you've said, and it was a very powerful statement, that both the inaccessibility of some of these sites, but also that you see children coming out in every corner in all of these stories, combined with the beheadings, the torture, the things that you see out of ISIS. You've said very publicly that your journalistic gauge has shifted. And I've been interested in that.
Well,
I mean,
obviously journalists' eyes are different. We see the immediate, our job is to tell the immediate stories about what's happening on the ground. And this is something different in terms of, I think it's slightly different than, in fact, very different from what we're talking about today. It's just simply, and again, it's following on from the discussion this morning we had about asymmetric warfare. Civilians are in harm's way. And unfortunately, in countries where the demographics are such that so many are young children, right. I've started talking to children a lot more because they know a lot about the war, sometimes more than the adults about the war, because they're not just caught in the crossfire, they're actually being targeted by one side or the other.
Let me invite some others into the conversation. Right up here.
Thank you so much. Scotty Greenwood, United States. I'm so happy to see you, Congressman
Do short
Norman.
form and no thank you. So let's just get right to the conversation. So,
happy to see you here. I'd like to see you on the ticket with Hillary in 2016. And while we're doing a dream team, it'd be great if Fran Townsend were the Secretary of Homeland Security. In terms of intelligence failures and what's happened with Snowden and WikiLeaks, et cetera, sources and methods that Canada and the United States use have been exposed. How nimble have we been, I asked this of the panel, to react to that? And I would also add not just sources and methods that our government uses, but we've also have massive data breaches when you look at Home Depot, Target, and the like, and our way of life is targeted when our economy is hit. So if you could comment on both of those.
Great.
Part of the equation, of course, that we can never overlook is countries like the United States, Canada, our allies, have to operate within the rule of law. We can never get away from that. And the challenge, whether it's public challenges from the media, internal challenge mechanisms, we have to constantly keep our eye on public confidence in being able to command that respect from the people that you represent. We cannot compromise our values while professing to protect them. So that's a very important backdrop, the rule of law. I think, I come back to how we have to collaborate and analyze the intelligence that we receive. This is the yoke, the heavy burden of office, when you have to make decisions on either too much intelligence or not enough intelligence. And too much, to the Admiral's point, is sometimes equally challenging to sort through.
Have you made a tough intelligence call where you withheld doing something and something bad happened?
No. Of course not.
Not as far as you know.
This is the after the fact analysis that really doesn't help, because I don't think there is any perfect intelligence to act on. There is always going to be a doubt, and the size of that doubt, like the size of your intelligence, is easy to parse after the fact. In the moment, when you have to decide to make what could be a life and death decision, this is very challenging. And just one last point, in this world where so much information is right there at the fingertips of a 14-year-old boy, a Pashtun living in the Hindu Kush, where he has as much ability to access information as the Pentagon or Langley or Ottawa, that is the world that we're now living in. And look, this isn't new. We've been at this for a very long time. The Enigma machine and our ability to parse information that we were able to pick up and figure out, and in some cases misdirect where our troops were going to land on the beaches of Europe, this has been around for a very, very long time, and we should be getting better at it. But because the rules of the game don't exist, this is what makes intelligence so challenging today.
The question, though, was, were sources and methods compromised by the massive leaks of WikiLeaks and the Snowden leaks? Answer is yes. In WikiLeaks, for example, were names of people who are the sources of information for our ambassador corps. In the Snowden take, there was our playbook, our technology playbook. This went way beyond the scope of the telephone metadata program, which is controversial, but nonetheless, it was a lot more than that. We've done better to protect leaks, but we can't overreact and go back into silos and not share information. It's a very tough problem. But for the future, going back to the first thing you said, Steve, about the wonderful David Ignatius books, yeah, we got to have more hacker types who advise on how we do intel and help us protect against what Mike Rogers warned about 2 days ago, which is this massive hacking of our systems, both public and private. And there has to be enormous collaboration between the public and private sectors. The private sector laps us, I would argue, in the ability to do some of this. And I don't think we should outsource it, but on the other hand, if we don't have seamless cooperation, everyone's going to lose.
I want to bring Fran Townsend in over here, and perhaps Max Boot if he wants, because there's been a discussion of we can't get too askew of our values in responding. And this is something, when you go back to the Cold War, and you look at how the Cold War was fought, so much of it was covert. We responded often in kind, in very nasty ways, to what the Soviets were doing. We operated through proxies. There was a kind of martial nature to that, which much of the rest of us were buffered from seeing. And one of the interesting questions that I think Max, but also the Bush administration, to some degree, put on the table is that we needed to meet harsh methods with a different methodology and a very different kind of war. And I think it's a very legitimate question to play around. And we had a discussion last night at the nightcap about the white ships that China is sending to challenge in various parts of the seas, that you see with what Russia has been doing in Ukraine, a kind of gray invasion, or a unflagged invasion, if you will. And so whether or not we need to begin thinking about stuff, so when we talk about norms and values in public, part of the intelligence question is, what do you do to really send a message to ISIS? What do you do to send a message to bad guys? We don't often have that discussion, but I think it's a legitimate and important one. So Fran, what nasty stuff would you recommend that we do that's not in public?
Well, yeah. Steve, I actually think, going back to a point both Minister McKay and Jane Harman made about the partnership with the public and private sectors, sometimes the most effective stuff you do isn't sort of the cloak and dagger black operations that you're alluding to. Sometimes it's something as simple as, we have this misnomer, we talk about open source intelligence. And I think for those in the audience and those watching this that believe open source means it's all publicly available and anybody can go out there. Well, the U.S. government, law enforcement and intelligence, I don't have to tell Admiral Rogers, are hamstrung. They can't look at that, or they can't easily look at it. Let's put it that way. There are legal restrictions and rules that prevent them. And so that's not true of the private sector. Jane mentioned in her opening remarks, Joe Lieberman, a former member of the Senate, Ambassador Mark Wallace, a bipartisan group that was created, a nonprofit. Because we're not members of the United States government, the Counter-Extremist Project isn't hamstrung by rules of predication and laws. And so we can go on the internet into what's truly to us open source and try to identify those accounts. We identify them, we sort of can only publicly name and shame. We can work with Twitter and other social media sites.
Have you had any successes yet?
We have. It's been, so I will, I'm happy to say Ask.fm, YouTube have been very responsive in terms of the partnership. Google's been very responsive. Twitter has been abysmally slow, and so it may take them 12 days to respond and shut an account. And the bad guy can open up another account in less time than it takes an American to get the results of an at-home pregnancy test. So obviously Twitter needs to get better.
Max, I want to go to Max for a minute. Do you want to comment on is there a microphone we can run to Max? Because Max raises this issue, and I think it's a legitimate, interesting one, about how we're organizing our military and defense capacity, and whether we're basically afraid of our own shadow. It's important. I bet you better take it.
I don't remember raising the afraid of your own shadow issue, but I mean, I think we do need to organize for the challenges the actual national security challenges we face, rather than those that we would prefer to face. And I think too much of our military planning and thinking is still going into fairly conventional scenarios, unlike the kind of very unconventional adversaries we actually face in ISIS or so many other threats. And I would say, our first and most important line of defense, since we have Admiral Rogers here, I think really is the the NSA and the kind of electronic surveillance that they're able to do in concert with our allies in Canada and Australia and New Zealand. And I'm very, as Jane Harman said, I think there's real cause for concern about the damage that's been done to that by Edward Snowden, not only in terms, I would say, of blowing actual programs, although he blew a lot of actual programs, but I think also in kind of changing the mindset and the mentality to be intensely suspicious of the kind of surveillance that we actually need to do in order to fight this faceless threat that we face. And so you see the pushback from Silicon Valley, I think, which is very concerning, that Apple is, putting out phones that are almost impossible to decrypt, at least on public information. And that's really shifting the balance, I think, in ways that are very concerning towards the bad guys, because I have grave concerns about our ability to penetrate these groups using human. I mean, we really got to rely on our intelligence, electronic surveillance, and if that's going to be reduced, then I think the risk is greatly heightened. So I think we have to be able to accept a certain abridgment of civil liberties and to stay safe from a group that we have no other way of truly fighting back against.
Thank you for that, Mike.
Can I just ask you, did the fall of Mosul take the intelligence community by surprise? And the rise of this savage...
The speed at which it occurred, I think.
And the rise of the Islamic State?
ISIL, let me finish the point I was going to make, and then I'll try to get back. The conundrum, I think, that we face, that goes to many of the issues that we've raised, is that risk has never been greater and trust has never been lower. Right. That is a huge mismatch that fundamentally, I think, for all of us in the Western liberal democracies, it's not unique to the United States, although clearly it's a major issue for us right now. It's not unique to us. We have got to overcome that. Now, we got to do it in an open way that people are comfortable with, because I'm the first to admit, both when in previous life, I was a thinker for a chairman, and now I find myself as a senior in the intelligence community. If we compromise who we are and what we are in the name of security, then I always believe that they have won. They've turned us into something fundamentally we're not. And I believe that we can maintain security without compromising our freedom. But I do remind people, look, a world of amazing freedom with limited security, I don't think is in our best interest. Just like a world of great security and limited freedom, I don't think we want that either. We got to try to find this middle ground, recognizing we live in a world of amazing risk today. And the risk is going, and the complexity of the risk keeps increasing.
Can I just applaud that and amend it and say that security and liberty are not a zero-sum game? We're either going to get more of both or less of both. And it was Ben Franklin over 200 years ago who actually said that. He said, he that shall surrender liberty for security deserves neither. And the trick is to fashion policies, not just in the U.S.
Though.
It's hard, but let me also...
We have a fight going on in the United States right now between Dianne Feinstein and the White House over exactly this issue, right?
Yeah, the proper oversight. I'm more on her side than I am on the CIA side, though I do understand that real people can get hurt. But it's a chapter we want to put behind us. I think looking forward, we have to be much more clever than we have been. And to get industry on our side, we have to understand that industry has a different customer base. These are international companies. They have German customers and Brazilian customers who are very unhappy with the United States now. And to sell more widgets or whatever they're doing, they have to speak to those publics too. So the goal, it would seem to me, is to have a robust public debate about security and liberty, but not just in the US. And to have this is answering your Dianne question, and to have our intelligence committees engage as an independent branch of government and do proper oversight. And that's what I think she really has been trying to do, and very unfortunately, she and John Brennan got off on the wrong foot on day one.
You had basically a very interesting case where one branch of government began to spy on another branch of government, and it's really shaken trust. And I'm sure, Mike, you're the kind of guy who's going to go out and restore all that trust again. But it must be an uphill
part of a
challenge.
broad dialogue. We have got to talk about this.
And part of this, I mean, to come back to, what are the very symbols of justice, is finding that proper balance, very delicate balance, and it involves the judiciary. In Canada, we, in seeking warrants, you require judicial oversight. For surveillance purposes, you require a forum where you can go, sometimes in secret, and get that judicial oversight, that green light to move forward on intelligence gathering. And that, I think, also reinforces and brings back some of the lost public confidence, if I can put it that way. I believe it was your President Reagan that talked about trust and verify, trust, and also keep that very important linkage into public confidence throughout this process. Because when you lose that, I think Admiral Rogers is right. You start to submit yourself to the exact world that the terrorists want you to live in, one of fear and mistrust, where public confidence, and it's shaken by things like what Pauline Neville-Jones referred to as dodgy dossiers.
Yeah,
that really undermines the public.
I promise we'll work around the one person in this room who trumps all of you is Pauline Neville-Jones, who has her hand up because she wrote the provocation for today, the plenary session essay, which for those of you watching online, you can get at the website for the Halifax International Security Forum called Get Smart, Gaining Intelligence and Missing the Meeting. It's a great essay, Pauline. So you get your quick intervention, and I promise to move to this side.
Right. I just wanted to make two comments, really, on what's been said. The first is with reference to what was said just a moment ago about the very considerable increase in encryption that's being used by the bad guys. It has had such a dramatic effect that I'll give you an example, that in the UK, where the security situation is pretty tight, we're finding that the police are having to go back to using, just padding around on the ground, following people, old-fashioned methods, because some of the other methods, electronic methods, are now no longer adequate, sufficient, or enable the coverage to take place. That is a real serious handicap on our ability to actually keep pace. Second thing I wanted to say was in reference to counter-propaganda. Yeah, this is an ideological war in many respects, and we've got to get really good at it. I think that what Fran's doing is very important. It's being done in other places as well. I think it's unlike the Cold War, where most of that was done in government and done very well. We got very good at black propaganda, and we need to get good at it again. But this time I think it has to be done largely in the private sector, and it has to be done by people who carry credibility with those we're seeking to influence. And we've got two audiences. Obviously, they are the bad guys themselves, but also those tempted by the bad guys, and they must be a priority for us.
I mean, Pauline, the one thing I would say, to come in, and I want to jump in right here, is that I was in Abu Dhabi last week, and a gentleman that's involved with a lot of startups said we need 100 million jobs in 10 years in this region of the Middle East. And we often at security forums don't think about the youth bulge, don't think about the job dimension, but it's as important to national security as anything else we're discussing here. So I would just put it back to you, when you talk about ideological wars, when you talk of this, without understanding what the incentives for particularly young men to join essentially death cults or these horrible groups, the question is, what else are they attracted to? And I'm not sure that is...
Well, I'd say two things about that. I mean, you're quite right to say there are huge numbers of young people, particularly young men, who don't have a point in life and often don't have the expectation of employment ahead of them. And it's a very, very big problem in the Middle East. But I also have in mind, the young people who form the recruiting pipeline from Europe and indeed from North America to some extent into the Middle East. These are not the poor. They are not poor. They are well educated. Most of them have at least one qualification, if not more. So it's a quite different audience, and we have to get at those people actually by action inside Muslim communities themselves. It cannot be done simply by nice white audience.
Terrific. Right here, in the front. And then in the back. Yes.
Yes, I'm Thomas Elvis, President of Estonia, and we have a lot of experience with cyber.
Mr. President, not always good.
But just a couple of observations. I mean, if we're going to have...
How many different governments have read your email?
I don't care. Because we have RSA 2048 encryption for all residents of Estonia.
Oh, interesting.
It's tough. Tough for you guys, too. No, but the point I was going to make, I mean, a number of observations around one general theme, which is that unless we develop cooperation among allies and like-minded liberal democracies, we're in trouble, because the nature of this, the whole cyber issue, is a priori cross-border. I mean, we're dealing with a nation-state paradigm in which someone comes over your border, you go and fight them. Well, all this stuff is going across borders all the time. And right now, I fear the liberal democratic West is losing. One of the news, a news I read an hour and a half ago, is the Germans have dropped the investigation of the hacking of Merkel's phone because they cannot find any evidence for it. In other words, we've been played. At the same time, German popular opinion, as a result of this news that supposedly came out, the supposed news that came out of Snowden, turns out to be completely false because they can't find it. So that's one problem we have, is a huge amount of, basically a huge amount of distrust in the alliance and across the transatlantic due to things that may or may not be true. So I'm beginning to think the Snowden operation is one of the best propaganda jobs ever, of all time. But nonetheless, we don't have much cooperation. Again, when we have, almost all cyber threats are by definition cross-border. The amount of cooperation among the countries being attacked, the values being attacked, is very, very low. In NATO, we have the paradigm of interoperability, so you can take a US missile, put it under a French plane, and fire it. In cyber, we are still in the intelligence mode that we share nothing, or if we do, it's the Five Eyes. And then we end up with situations, for example, in Europe, where our guys who are very good discover something, and then someone else's guys who are very good discover something. They've discovered the same thing, but there's no real form of saying, hey, look, we just found this new sort of, Ouroboros, they came out, but whatever, you discover something, and there's no cooperation in this field. And unless we start doing that, we will be in smaller countries or whatever.
Let me just ask Mike Rogers for a minute to respond, because one of the really interesting challenges in a world we have today is that I think forums like this are promulgating something I think is worthy, which is allies, nations trying to work together to create common themes and bonds, a commons international security. But sometimes there are fractures in that. And when you get down to what the president just said, how far are you willing to go in disclosing your toolkit, your secret sauce for what you do in the spirit of cooperating versus what you feel you have to hold back because fundamentally there's an element of mistrust even with those you pretend to trust a lot?
We fundamentally share a great deal of insight with a great many nations. Probably 3/4 of the nations represented in this room.
But what's a great deal, like on a 0 to 10?
We have a relationship, and we are regularly sharing much more information with you than others.
8.
In every case, to be honest, it'll be vary by nation. It'll also vary by the complexity of the challenges that we're dealing with. Now,
how about Canada?
I do agree with a member of the Five Eyes, again, a little different. I do think the president makes a very important point. Cyber is the ultimate team sport because it does not recognize geography. It does not recognize these traditional boundaries that we have between what is the private sector versus what is the public sector versus what is a national security issue. Cyber, to me, fundamentally is a national security issue that is a challenge to every one of us as a nation. Therefore, it represents a great opportunity for us to really get together and work a tough problem set in a very common multidimensional way across multiple nations and multiple partnerships in the private side, because it isn't just going to be the governments of the world are going to fix this problem.
Let me cluster a few comments.
I said, last observation. Right. We really have to get more aware of this. 2011 was the first time the Munich Security Conference ever had a panel on cybersecurity. Last year was the first year the premier journal on security studies, published its first article on cybersecurity, written by an Estonian, by the way. But anyway, the point is that it is not seeped into the consciousness. You can have long discussions in Munich, and by people who are very concerned about security issues, and there's no word of cyber. This is 2014.
Well,
3 years.
to be fair, I think that's one of the points I was raising about the Ignatius novel for a moment, is that there are clusters of people that are obsessed with this issue. I think many of them are here, but there are other places where these discussions are going on with different populations, luckily some of whom work for the NSA. Yes, ma'am, we're going to cluster a few comments and questions right there.
Banal Omar. I'm the acting vice president for the Middle East and Africa Center at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And I have 2 points just very quickly. The one is actual kind of a practitioner's plea. I think one of the challenges when we're framing NGO workers or journalists or humanitarian workers as open intelligence is it justifies the targeting of civilians that we're seeing, which with a limited access, I think then challenges our ability to really have access on the ground with this shrinking humanitarian space. And that kind of ties to my second question, which is how much of it is really a failure of intelligence versus a lack of political will? And I go to the question that you raised about how Mosul was taken by surprise or the speed of it, whereas we were hearing 2 years earlier, particularly what we saw in Anbar, and we were told and reassured this is an overstretch at Anbar, but we pretty much predicted 2 years earlier not only the fall of Mosul, but the rout. And so again, how much of is that lack of intelligence versus political will?
Great, thank you. And how about someone on this side, right here, John Glenn.
Thank you. I'm John Glenn from the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. I'd like to press the panel on the question of trust. In some ways, it's a troubling one to me because it seems to suggest that what we need to do is reassure each other of each other's intentions. And I'm sure that's not enough. And yet, it has very specific policy consequences that fall outside of your realm. Germany suddenly questions whether they'll sign the trade deal because of the problem of trust around the Snowden revelations. You can't control that, but what can you do beyond reassuring everyone of our good intentions and of the challenges and the risks that we face to restore trust?
Kevin Barron in the back.
I'm also a journalist. I want to hear more about transparency. You know, this year's INSA Intelligence Conference, just across the board in the intelligence community, there's a feeling that you need to be more transparent to earn that trust back. Earlier today, Ambassador Vershbow said the same thing. We could be a lot more forthcoming with some of what we're doing to help earn the trust. So I wanted to ask, what can you be telling the American people more of that will give you that trust that you're looking for?
Thank you. Let's just take one more right here.
Ayman Mhanna from Lebanon. What kind of support is given to smaller countries, not necessarily your best allies, but places where problems might arise and there is a need to cooperate, for example, with the local police forces, local intelligence forces through technology or through some techniques of gathering and analyzing information? Are these cooperation projects on the table? And two, are there conditions that you impose in terms of respect of some basic rule of law things when using some of the techniques you're sharing? Because looking at the situation, at least Lebanon and Jordan, probably these conditions of rule of law are not being fulfilled completely.
Thank you. So let me get some responses here. We have supports for smaller players, Kevin Barron on transparency questions, John Glenn on sort of beyond trust, what we do to beyond trust, the question about how we frame and target those in the NGO, journalist open space, and whether we set up those fields for kidnapping and killing, and whether some of the big challenges that are out there are failures of intelligence or failures of will. Peter?
Let me take a hook at a few of those. On the trust and transparency piece, one way to do so is to talk more about your security infrastructure, security oversight, make that process of how you are challenging and pushing on those individuals like the Admiral tasked with this important role. Another way to do it in terms of garnering public support is share some of the successes. Because in the intelligence world, a lot of this is proving a negative. A lot of this is what you were able to prevent. And it isn't often made public. Even with the success, we had something called the Toronto 18, where they were able to penetrate a terrorist cell that was operating in our country. And then the subsequent trials and some of the disclosures that came out, I think, reinforced the need for intelligence, the need for some of the actions that our security forces had undertaken. But the reality is, much of this, by nature, by design, has to be done out of the view of the general public, out of the view of the journalists. It is also very important to come back to this issue of what is the deterrent effect of having those who are being supervised knowing that you're doing so. And what is the message that is sent? The U.S. ambassador to NATO did say perhaps we do need to show a little bit more leg and tell them this is what we're undertaking as a deterrent. Now, does that work with China and Russia? Maybe. Does it work with ISIL? Not at all. And so that is part of the calculation. I think how much disclosure impacts directly on how effective your intelligence gathering can be if you upset the balance.
You know, as we go through these questions, can I just piggyback one element? Because some people have mentioned Edward Snowden. There's also been a debate in the United States about the Navy SEAL team folks that killed bin Laden. And there, you know, folks that come out one way or another, either as those that are divulging national security intelligence or those that were involved in covert acts, are finding that there's so much interest that they become global celebrities. And has that undermined the ability, Admiral, to have faith and confidence that you can operate covertly, that you can do the kinds of things you're doing in a sort of, or are these just sort of flash in the pan anomalies?
No, I would say it's certainly frustrating at times. Having said that, I always try to remind the workforce, look, part of being a professional is if you see something that you believe is illegal, immoral, or unethical, then I expect you as a professional to raise this issue. What I ask of you in doing so is to ensure you use the multiple mechanisms that are available for you to do that. The answer is not, I'm right, everybody else is wrong, and I'm stealing. That's not the answer for us, collectively, I would argue. Yeah. The other challenge I think we find, and it goes to the transparency piece the minister was discussing about, at least in the US. In the structure that we built in the 1970s that we really use today, we counted on the court, the power of a court, and the role of a Congress. Flash forward 45 years later. We have to be honest with ourselves. Intelligence operates in a broader context. And the context of the United States right now is we increasingly don't trust our mechanisms of governance. So what do you do when you've got an oversight mechanism that your population just fundamentally has low trust in? What do you do when the court that you've counted on to act as that neutral arbitrator, people look at it and go, well, it's a rubber stamp. We don't believe it. We don't trust it. I'll be the first of it. I'm still trying to work my way through. So how do you set up an oversight structure in this time, in this place, that resonates with people in a way that clearly the one that we have had to date, many people are suspicious of?
But the flip side is that if the courts, for example, say, no, you can't go there, and you're going to be operating in the dark, this is also a very challenging issue, and that's why I think the judiciary themselves have to be brought into the conversation, which is a little bit outside the box from where we've been in Canada, at least, because our security forces have been told on occasion that you can't get something, for example, as basic IP advice, IP addresses.
Do your colleagues understand that, or do you get criticized for that position?
Well, the government always wears it. Always wears it. When there's an intelligence failing because you didn't know, or you acted improperly, it will always come back to the government. Rightly so.
Jane?
Let me add a few things here. In the 70s, after well-documented abuses by the Nixon administration, there was something called the Church Committee, which was a congressional oversight investigations committee, which recommended changes, two of which were passage of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, which is our major law for regulating how we collect information on individuals, and the other was to form the intelligence committees in the House and the Senate. And this framework was enacted on a bipartisan basis by an overwhelming vote. Can you imagine? Congress used to do that, John Barrasso. And that law is still on our books. What went wrong is, after 9/11, I'm not imputing the motives, but nonetheless, the Bush administration, part one, Bush 43, first term, decided to go around Congress in enacting a lot of the programs we have through the president's Article 2 Commander-in-Chief authorities. Congress eventually caught up, amended FISA to include all these programs. There was a debate in 2008. FISA was amended, but the problem is not enough of the public tuned in. The one advantage of the Snowden leaks, and I don't think he was a whistleblower, he could have taken advantage of many more mechanisms inside the government to be heard than he did. But the one advantage is now we are having a public debate in the United States and around the world, and I think that's a good thing. There has to be public buy-in, and the public has to understand that these programs operate strictly within the law, a point that I think all of us are making. And there is review in the United States by this FISA court, a federal court which has federal judges who rotate in and out. And 25% of the time, the requests are turned down. It's not a rubber stamp court.
I want to go to Lisa in a minute. I want somebody to give a microphone to Senator Barrasso to ask us the question we haven't yet answered. But please.
So I just wanted to pick up on the point that Pauline made, which is this issue of working within the communities to try and be aware of some of the threats, some of those who may be going abroad to study in Syria. And with the problem, I would imagine, of having human intelligence on the ground in the areas where groups like Islamic State are operating, working within the communities is really crucial. And yet the experts seem to be warning that there is going to be a balance between punishment and intelligence gathering. Because if you say, well, your son, when he comes back to, in this case, Britain, is going to have his passport taken from him. He'll be, persona non grata. He may face a large prison sentence. That mothers and wives and that may not be willing to, cooperate. And I think it's going to be very finely balanced in all of the countries. And as we all know, how many countries are sending foreign fighters to Syria. That this is going to get the balance between trust and intelligence gathering right. The other thing is what President Ilves was talking about, trust with the allies, and the allies feeling that you're working with them closely. I just interviewed Davutoglu, the new prime minister in Turkey, a few weeks ago, and I said, well, what are you going to do to stop the flow of foreign fighters across your border? And he says, well, I said to, in this case, the British government, you need to tell us who's coming to Turkey. And they said, oh, no, we can't do that. We can't give you the names. We're a democracy. We wouldn't be able to do that. And he says, well, can you give me the names of the people once there? Oh, no, we're not allowed to give you that information, but you should find. To which he said, listen, I have 34 million tourists a year in Turkey. I don't have the capacity to be able to put someone on every one of them. So there is being pushed back by some of the allies in what has to be a global coalition, is that it has to be a fair and a level playing field.
John Barrasso, I just want to have you show everyone what magazine you're carrying around right now. He's carrying around the Atlantic, the latest issue he got early. So thank you very much. Go ahead, John. Yeah,
a shameless plug.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
Who wants to be reminded of midlife crisis in the middle of it?
Exactly.
Last month's issue was even better, the Atlantic, the ideas issue. So that's why I've brought this for my daughter. It is interesting. It doesn't seem like too long ago that with Osama bin Laden, they were looking at videotapes, trying to figure out what cave he happened to be hiding in.
Right.
And now with ISIS and the technology, they have their own drones. They're putting things up immediately.
Right.
And are shamelessly going out there. And as we try to make sure that we can connect the dots. Peter talked about just the straws of information that are out there. Knowledge is power. And my concern is when the Admiral talks about how many different people are out working in that area, that people aren't sharing the information. So when you say it's a team sport, it's not like a football team where people are working together to score.
Right.
Sometimes it's like a track team where different people want to have their own areas of excellence. So the concern is, if you're spending time looking to prevent this next terrorist attack from an outside group, how at the same time you're able to find that individual who is self-radicalized just sitting at home in their basement looking at the computer.
Yeah, and Senator Barrasso just talked about ISIS having its own drones. I just want to piggyback that everyone can have their own drones fairly soon. And what sort of world is that where with listening devices or delivery mechanisms or targeting, you just have combining big data with drone intelligence and listening. Mike, what kind of world is that going to be, Admiral?
A lot more complicated. As I remind people, the world is becoming an incredible network of sensors, whether they're operated by governments, by individuals, by the private side. Senator, I would just, before I forget, one point to you. That's an interesting challenge for us on the U.S. side, given the laws that we have. And I'm not saying they're good or bad, but given the laws. I am a foreign intelligence organization, not a domestic intelligence organization. And so there's very specific things that I cannot do under the law. It's an interesting challenge, I think, for all of us in the Western democracies as this internal radicalization phenomena continues to grow. And I don't see it as something short term. I think this is a long-term challenge for us. What are the implications for our security, for our law enforcement, for our intelligence organizations? At least for us, much of us was built on the idea of the threat was outside, not necessarily inside. Now, don't get me wrong, FBI, law enforcement, they have a domestic role. But I think there's an interesting challenge here for the Western democracies about how we're going to deal with this.
This is absolutely the world we live in, and there's no getting away from it. The sophistication and cyber, all of this we are grappling with, but you know, where things went dark in the intelligence world in Afghanistan, for example, was when they started just passing notes. You know, this is carrier pigeon technology versus the internet.
Yeah.
And we also have off-the-shelf technology now. You know, a radio-controlled car that you can get at Radio Shack was being used to ignite IEDs. So, and you talk about drones, you can build drones now. There is so much ability to cause harm in the world. And so, again, it comes back to how do we detect it? How do we find out where it's being planned and when it's going to happen? And I think Lisa's point about the cross-cultural outreach and how we get into communities, human intelligence is still, I think, the most raw but important form of intelligence that we have. If parents of a teenager who is acting strangely and going to certain websites, exhibiting a certain behavior, we need to have a system that is open to receiving that information and acting on it. We have in Canada a system that we get advice from a cross-cultural advisory group that are doing work in our communities, that are providing that type of outreach and assurance. And I think that helps with transparency and public confidence, too.
We have that in the U.S. too. Many police departments have built trust with Muslim and other communities and are getting information. That kid who's self-radicalizing is not going to be known to somebody who works at the NSA. He's going to be known to his mother or the person he lives with someplace. But that's a piece of it. But back to the drone problem. 70 countries have drone technology. I think now 5 are able to weaponize drones. People are exporting drones. And when you think about the decision the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, made in the United States to license U.S. airspace to drones, I think, number one, our Fourth Amendment, which protects individuals from government, could easily be shredded by this advance, if you can call it an advance. I think it's horrible. But number two, unless we are able to build trust across the world and have the civilized community understand the common threats we face and have a common terminology and understanding, the bad guys are going to have the advantage. And that is just this is probably this year or the next couple years when are the tipping point. We're either going to get this right or we're going to lose. I mean, I don't mean to be so pessimistic. I have my own grandchildren I want to protect. But if we can't get ahead of this social media onslaught with bad messages permeating everywhere and reaching this youth bulge we were talking about this morning, no matter how many print Atlantic magazines we sell, Steve, it's not.
What was interesting is, you know, when James Foley was beheaded, our chairman, David Bradley, was involved with various efforts, Senator McCain, others, to try to get some of those journalists released, succeeded in Theo Curtis. But in the case of James Foley, it was horrible what ISIS was doing, clearly propaganda. And I tweeted out a picture of James Foley that was beautiful. And I said, this is the picture that should be tweeted out about Foley, not what ISIS was doing. It was retweeted about 40,000 times. But then ISIS began responding to everyone. It was amazing to look at the ISIS culture. And I wondered if Mike Rogers was out there. And so I began asking these guys in ISIS, rather than just shutting them down, saying, what is your world going to produce? What cell phone? What kind of technology is your world going to produce? And then some of them would respond back and saying, when we have our caliphate, we will make something better than an iPhone. And I said, really? Let's get into that. But it raised the question, because I hadn't met Mike Rogers yet, on whether or not those folks who are operating somewhere out there and engaging, there's an ecosystem that's in all of our countries where people are subscribing into this sort of hate culture.
But that's what most threatens them, Steve. That's why they're upset about the Halifax International Security Forum, because we're sharing ideas, we're testing our values with one another, we're challenging each other in a very completely open, transparent way. That doesn't exist in their world. And this issue about you retweeting pictures that forward the radicalization cause, that came up yesterday. And in the intelligence world, you obviously don't want to perpetuate their cause by glorification or by giving any substance to what they're trying to do to reach people, either to scare them or attract them. But it's also a very important tool, let's not forget. If we strip everything down that they're posting, and the justification for doing that is, well, we don't want to contribute to further radicalization, it also takes away an important tool to track them,
right,
and to entrap them. And that's also part of this.
We have the better arguments. We just have to use the new vehicles smartly to win. And winning means winning the argument. We're not going to win this kinetically. We're going to win this because we have better ideas and open societies, which is what they really want in the end anyway, or most of their followers want.
But only for the men.
Mentioned something about those images that you mentioned, and there was a whole movement on Twitter with all of the hostages that were beheaded was don't show this last picture, show Alan Henning when he's there with some Syrians, show Jim Foley, don't give them oxygen. But we had a very interesting example of who makes the decision about what should be in the public domain or not. I was at the annual Bayou Calvados War Reporting Awards this year. And there was a huge unease there because a Turkish journalist had put in for the awards pictures of beheading of Syrian soldiers. And the judging panel said, oh, this was before we had the Islamic State videos of Jim Foley and Stephen Sotloff. The judging panel said, oh, we shouldn't have those in, but we better not censor it. Okay, put them on the short list. And then by the time the award ceremony came, we'd had the rise of the Islamic State. We've had the terrible videos of Jim Foley and Stephen Sotloff and Alan Henning. And then you had this problem that the beheading pictures were going to be shown. The jury of the journalists said, no, we're not going to choose. They chose something from Bahrain, which was very subtle, very aesthetic. But when the public decided what was the main photography prize, they chose the most gruesome of images. They said, the images are there, we want to see them. And so many people at that forum said that their teenage sons or daughters looked at the videos. I haven't looked at the videos. I don't want to have that in my head. But they said their kids did and said, well, it's there. We're going to have a look at it. But both with the public and with the students who chose the prizes for war reporting, they chose the two worst set of images which had been shunned by the journalistic community, which gave all the journalists pause for thoughts. I mean, who's the arbiter of what should be out there and what's not? And does the new generation look at this differently?
But that's what's so jarring about it now.
Yeah.
I have a boy who's a year and a half old. He will be part of the most informed generation, as will, we hope, every generation going forward. And he has the world at his fingertips now with a click of an icon. So all of that information is there, but all the things I would never want him to see are also there.
Yeah.
As soon as he's old enough to be able to move those icons, he's able to access
We just
that.
have a couple of minutes. Can you do yours in 15 seconds?
Yes,
Great.
Again, Red Taslim, Middle East Institute. I think in terms of the argument, yes, we have the argument, but also I like to agree with you. It's also the authenticity of the messenger, and we have to be humble about how much we can do. I think that messenger has to come from the region. That debate has been going on for some time, so it's not only about message, but also about authenticity of the message.
Thank you for that comment. In the very back? Can you do it in 15 seconds? If you can't, then you don't get the mic.
You're out.
Cut his mic.
I will try. I would like to relay the challenge to Admiral Rogers from Russia. 1 week ago, after Putin is back from Brisbane, our Putin's TV came with a
We really
story.
are short, so it has to be a question. We don't have time for a big explanation.
Very, very short one. So it came with the story that the MH17 has been shot again by Ukrainian Air Force with some data. And the question was, why would Americans, if they are so sure that it was Russians who were shooting, would not relay their own data? Why wouldn't you?
Interesting. And is there a question over on this side? It can be 15 seconds. Okay, good. We're all set. Oh, one right here. Yes. We'll take you as the final comment question right here.
Rachel Kleinfeld, Carnegie Endowment. I know we're in a world of threat. We all focus on it, but this has been an immensely reactive panel. Some of the biggest intelligence failures have been failures of opportunity. We didn't see the fall in 1989 of the Soviet Union. We didn't see the Arab Spring. How much of our intelligence assets are looking for things that we can manipulate to make the world a little bit better?
Thank you.
Good.
Well, that's what Rumsfeld called what we don't know about. Now it's the unknown unknowns that we're into.
That is, although I think that I only speak for me as an intelligence professional. I constantly tell the team that is where we generate our greatest value. Not what is, not that that's not important, but what will be. Because there we can help shape policymakers to make better decisions, we can help reduce uncertainty, and we can try to help simplify very complex things in a way that help enable decisions, whether that be a policymaker or an operational commander. I will also tell you, it is the hardest thing to do within the intelligence arena.
I'm not sure, Rachel, I think it's a great question, but I think that's a question for policymakers, not for intelligence gatherers. I don't think there is or should be a clear wall between intelligence and policy. I think intelligence has to be policy relevant. But if we have analysts at, pick one of our intelligence agencies or the Canadian one, making policy, I worry. I think this issue about making the right arguments and winning them is the way that we're going to take advantage of opportunities, and I think that is the charge for all of us. It's not just a U.S. charge, and yes, the region's voice and face has to lead that charge. That's the way we're going to get folks on the ground. Forget whose boots are on the ground. That's the way we're going to get buy-in from folks on the ground and create the change in the Middle East that I think the people there deserve and want to see and that we want to see. If we don't take advantage of that, our fault, but also our huge loss.
Lisa?
But I just wonder, though, in your comment about trying to imagine what will be, is our imagination big enough to have imagined what would the rise of the Islamic State, the kind of savagery we're seeing, the kind of slick videos that they produce? You would think it was the stuff of fiction. The world is moving in ways that are beyond the pale, and within the way we look at the world, I think very difficult to contemplate what we're seeing now, that the rise of that kind of a political terrorist group, a terrorist group, that no one could have foreseen it. And I think because most people would not look at the world in that way.
I mean, I don't think so personally. Their media capability, phenomenal, best in the world. But you can argue, if you've studied the problem a long time, another continuing progression of trends that we have been seeing for a long time. The biggest challenge, I've said this publicly before with respect to ISIL, the biggest challenge I thought, where I fault myself as an intelligence senior, I didn't anticipate the transition from an insurgency to an element that was interested in holding ground and forming governance, if you will. I only speak for myself. I wish that I had anticipated that and caught that sooner, personally.
I'd simply just say in closing, I think it's been a fantastic discussion. We've thought a little bit like in the old Herman Conway, thinking what the unthinkables were down the road. I think that when we started and talked both about Dana Priest's critique of the intelligence establishment, which has become huge, but as Rachel just said, there have been missteps and sort of failures in that process. But when you also look at the world of sensors that are coming, just 2 days ago, I participated in a forum that had nothing to do with national security. It had to do with big data and cars. Toyota convened something about whether or not what the social contract is with people who buy their cars and cars, about the data that they are acquiring about the behavior, the places that people drive. This is a private sector initiative. And then what the government, the Department of Transportation in the United States are going to do. The world that we're going into, to take Mike's challenge of what will be in 5 or 10 years from now, where we essentially retrofit every aspect of our lives with sensors and data collection, requires a return to the broad question, not only of national security, but what is our social contract amongst each other and our institutions to both keep ourselves safe, but also continue to allow liberty in the way in which we think we all deserve. So I want to thank Lise Doucette, Admiral Mike Rogers, Minister Peter MacKay, and of course, Jane Harman. Thank you very much for a wonderful discussion.